Picture this. You're standing in a black dress at your father's funeral, the Georgia heat pressing through stained glass windows. When the family you've bled for turns their backs, they mock you in whispers meant to be heard, slice you from the will like cutting cancer, then help themselves to everything you helped build. They mistake your silence for surrender, but silence can be sharpened into something deadly, and some inheritances are taken, not given. This is how I took back what was mine and then took everything else. My name is Elena Monroe, and I buried my father on a Tuesday when the Spanish moss hung so still it looked painted against the Savannah sky. The cemetery stretched out in perfect rows, old Confederate headstones mixing with modern marble, and the smell of magnolias couldn't quite mask the fresh earth waiting for him. I stood in my only black dress bought 3 years ago for a client's funeral, watching my mother Irene orchestrate grief like a symphony conductor. "Move the flowers closer to the casket," she commanded the funeral director, her voice carrying that particular Southern authority that made grown men scramble. "Victor, stand here. You're the eldest son. People need to see the family properly." My brother Victor, 41 and soft around the middle from too many business lunches, adjusted his Armani suit and took his position. He'd flown in from Atlanta in his leased Mercedes, the one I'd co-signed for when his credit tanked after his third failed venture. Neither of them looked at me as I stood slightly apart, holding the program I'd stayed up until 3 in the morning designing because Irene said the funeral home's template looked cheap. The service itself was a performance. Irene had insisted on the largest chapel at Brennan & Sons Funeral Home, though Dad would have preferred something simple. She wore a black suit that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage I knew because she'd charged it to the credit card I'd given her for emergencies only. Victor delivered a eulogy about a father who'd taught him business acumen and family values, conveniently forgetting the nights Dad had called me. Not him, when the loneliness got too heavy after their separation. During the repast at the mansion on Forsyth Park, another of Irene's expensive choices, I was refilling my sweet tea when I heard them. They were gathered near the French doors overlooking the courtyard, my Aunt Delia's voice cutting through the chamber music. "Poor Elena," she said, though her tone suggested anything but pity. "Always the helper, never the heir. Irene told me everything's going to Victor and her, as it should be. The boy needs it for his business ventures." "She's got her little job," my cousin Margaret added, picking at the shrimp and grits. What does she need with family property? She's always been so independent." Independent. They said it like a disease. Like the years I'd spent building my career at Sterling and Wade Financial, becoming their youngest senior estate planner, were a character flaw rather than an achievement. Like the nights I'd driven 2 hours each way to check on Dad, cook his meals, manage his medications while they posted Facebook prayers from a distance. Meant nothing. I set down my glass carefully, my hands surprisingly steady, and walked toward the private room where Irene had asked to meet with immediate family only. She and Victor were already seated at the polished table when I entered, a man in a gray suit sitting across from them with documents spread like tarot cards predicting my future. Ah, Elena. The lawyer, Mr. Hutchinson, according to his brass nameplate, acknowledged me with the kind of smile reserved for people about to receive bad news. "Please, sit." "We wanted to discuss your father's estate," Irene began, her voice taking on that false sweetness she used when preparing to twist the knife. "Mr. Hutchinson has reviewed the will, the one Dad updated 6 months ago," I asked, remembering the day he'd mentioned seeing a lawyer, how tired he'd looked, how Irene had been hovering around him more than usual. "Yes." Victor leaned back, confident as a casino owner who knows the house always wins. "Dad wanted to make sure everything was properly arranged." Mr. Hutchinson cleared his throat. "Your father's estate, valued at approximately $850,000, including the family home here in Savannah and the lake house in South Carolina, has been left to your mother and brother." He paused, shuffling papers unnecessarily. "There's a note in the codicil explaining his reasoning." He read in a monotone that somehow made it worse. Elena has always been provided for through her own means and career. I leave the family assets to those who need them most. The words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Provided for, as if the $40,000 I'd poured into saving the lake house from foreclosure existed in some alternate universe. As if the medical bills I'd covered when Irene's shopping addiction drained their savings had been a fever dream. As if every time Victor had promised to pay me back next quarter when the deal closes had actually meant something. "You understand," Irene said, already standing, already dismissing me. "Your father only wanted what was best for the family." I understood perfectly. I understood that in their eyes. I had never been the family, just the one who paid for it. That night, I sat in my apartment overlooking River Street, watching the tourist boats drift by while sorting through a shoebox I'd labeled family in my meticulous handwriting. Every receipt, every text message screenshot, every IOU scrawled on napkins, I'd kept them all, though I'd never intended to use them as evidence. They were just reminders of love, or what I'd thought was love. The first receipt was from 8 years ago, $3,000 for Irene's emergency root canal that somehow became veneers for her entire upper row. She'd cried on my doorstep at 11:30 at night, mascara running down her cheeks, swearing Daddy couldn't know she'd spent the money he'd given her on a cruise with her book club. "Just until my investment account matures next month," she'd promised. Next month never came. Then there was Victor's greatest hits collection. The $10,000 for his food truck venture, the one that never got past the logo design phase. The $15,000 for his revolutionary app that would connect local farmers with restaurants, which died when he discovered apps required actual programming knowledge. The $25,000 my entire emergency fund for his sure-thing investment in his friend's brewery that went belly up before they'd even signed a lease. "Your family," he'd always say, clapping me on the shoulder like we were teammates. "Family helps family. Besides, you're doing so well at that firm of yours. This is just seed money to you. Right, wrong. Every dollar I gave them was a dollar I didn't put toward my own dreams. The bistro I'd wanted to open with my college roommate dead because I had no capital. The downtown condo I'd had my eye on sold to someone else while I was covering Victor's mortgage for 3 months. The MBA program at Emory postponed indefinitely because Irene needed help with her property taxes. But the lake house, God, the lake house was the worst betrayal sitting in this box. 3 years ago, I'd gotten a call at my office at 2:15 in the afternoon. Dad, sounding older than his 70 years, admitting they were about to lose the family property in South Carolina, the place where we'd spent every summer, where he'd taught me to fish off the dock, where my grandparents' ashes were scattered across the water. "I wouldn't ask," he'd said. "But Victor's having some troubles, and your mother, well, you know how she is with money." I knew. I'd always known. But I co-signed anyway, putting my credit on the line, draining my investment portfolio to cover the $42,000 in back taxes and penalties. The paperwork was all here, my name on every document, my signature keeping their legacy afloat. They'd celebrated that Christmas at the lake house, posting photos on Instagram of the whole family gathered by the fireplace. The family, -1. I'd been working overtime to rebuild my savings. There were smaller cruelties, too, documented in this archive of exploitation. The 500 here, 800 there, for Irene's various emergencies that always seemed to coincide with Nordstrom sales. The weekend trips I'd funded when Victor needed to network for his businesses, which meant golf resorts and whiskey tastings. The medical bills when Dad's insurance lapsed because Irene had forgotten to pay the premiums, too busy planning her garden club's spring gala. I picked up a Christmas card from 3 years ago. Inside, Irene's perfect cursive. "Thank you for all you do for this family. We couldn't manage without our rock." Our rock. That's what I was. Something to stand on, build on, take for granted. Rocks don't need inheritance. Rocks don't have feelings. Rocks just hold everyone else up while slowly being worn away. The text messages were almost worse than the receipts. Victor's, "Hey sis, small favor," followed by requests for thousands. Irene's, "Don't mention this to your father, but..." preceding another financial crisis of her own making. The promises to pay back, the guilt trips when I hesitated, the cold shoulders when I just once said I couldn't help because I was saving for my own future. "You're so lucky," Irene had said that one time. "No husband, no children, just that nice job of yours. You don't understand the pressures we face. The pressure of spending money you don't have. The pressure of failing at every business venture because you refuse to do the actual work. The pressure of maintaining a facade of wealth while bleeding your daughter dry. No, I suppose I didn't understand those pressures. I pulled out the last document, the one that hurt the most. A photo from Dad's 70th birthday party at the lake house. I'd organized everything, cooked all his favorites, even tracked down his Navy buddies for a surprise reunion. In the picture, he's hugging Victor while Irene poses with her hand on his shoulder. I'm in the background, barely visible, carrying dishes to the kitchen. The helper, not the heir. They hadn't even waited for him to be cold in the ground before making it official. The full weight of the inheritance hit me 3 days after the funeral when I received the official copy of the will from Mr. Hutchinson's office. $850,000. The family home on East Gaston Street, a Victorian worth at least $400,000 in Savannah's historic district. The lake house in South Carolina that I'd personally saved from foreclosure. All of it signed over to Irene and Victor with surgical precision. But it was the language that twisted the knife deeper. Because Elena has always been provided for through her own means and career, I leave the family assets to those who need them most. Those 16 words erased decades of sacrifice, transforming my responsibility into a liability, my independence into an excuse for exclusion. I read the will again in my office at Sterling and Wade, door locked, blinds drawn. My assistant Sarah had been fielding my calls all morning, telling clients I was in meetings. But I was really sitting there, staring at legal language I understood all too well from my years as an estate planner, finding every place where my father's signature had sealed my erasure. The house on East Gaston Street I'd spent summers painting those shutters had personally paid for the new roof when a hurricane tore through 5 years ago. Irene had called me at 6:45 in the morning, hysterical about water damage, and I'd written a check for $12,000 without hesitation. Now it was hers entirely. The lake house was worse. My name was still on financial documents as co-signer, meaning I was legally responsible for any remaining debt. But the deed had been transferred solely to Victor through some legal maneuvering I was starting to piece together. He'd get the asset. I'd keep the liability. It was almost elegant in its cruelty. Then there were the investment accounts, the life insurance policies, even the antique furniture I'd helped Dad restore. Everything itemized, everything allocated to someone else. The cherry wood desk where he'd taught me to balance a checkbook Victor's, the pearl necklace that had belonged to my grandmother, the one she'd fastened around my neck on my 16th birthday Irene's, the signed first edition books I'd helped him collect from estate sales across Georgia, divided between them like splitting a deck of cards. My phone buzzed with a text from Victor. "Hey sis, need to discuss transition timeline for Lake House. Want to rent it out ASAP? Can you handle the paperwork since you know that stuff?" The audacity of it stole my breath. He wanted me to handle the paperwork, to facilitate my own exclusion, to use my expertise to help him profit from the property I'd saved. I pulled up my personal financial records, the ones I kept meticulously as any good financial planner would. Over the past decade, I'd given them $97,000, not loans gifts, because family doesn't charge interest, as Irene always said when promising to pay me back. That didn't include the co-signed loans, the credit cards I'd guaranteed, the times I'd covered their bills directly to avoid late fees that would tank their credit. Meanwhile, my own account held $32,000. That was it. My entire life's savings after paying for their emergencies, their failures, their maintaining of appearances. I made good money at Sterling and Wade, $95,000 a year plus bonuses. But good money means nothing when it flows through your fingers to fill other people's pockets. I thought about the reasoning again, provided for through her own means. Yes, I had a career. Yes, I had a steady paycheck. But that career had become an ATM for family withdrawals. Those means had been consistently drained by the very people now citing them as reasons to cut me out entirely. The bitter irony was that I was the only one who actually understood how to manage money. Irene would burn through her portion within 2 years. I guaranteed it. Victor would sink it into another failed venture, probably within 18 months. The house would be reverse mortgaged, the lake house would fall into disrepair, and eventually, they'd come knocking on my door again. Except this time, they'd have already taken everything. I opened my laptop and pulled up the estate planning software I used for clients. Out of professional curiosity or maybe masochism, I ran the numbers on what my financial position would have been if I'd kept that $97,000, invested it conservatively, lived my life without the constant drain of family need. The number that came back made me close the laptop and put my head in my hands. $340,000. That's what I would have had. Enough for the bistro, enough for the condo, enough for the MBA and a year off to travel, enough for a life that was actually mine. Instead, I had $32,000 and a box full of receipts that proved I'd funded the very fortune I'd been excluded from inheriting. The responsible one, the independent one, the one who didn't need help. They were right about one thing: I didn't need their help, but they'd been wrong about something crucial. Just because I'd always provided didn't mean I always would. I didn't explode. I didn't call them screaming. I didn't post a vindictive rant on Facebook for all the family to see. Instead, I did what I did best I planned. For the first time in my life, I used my expertise for myself instead of cleaning up their messes. The first step was observation. I watched their social media, noting Irene's posts about renovating the East Gaston house, Victor's announcements about his exciting new venture in hospitality, using the lake house as a rental property. They were already spending money they didn't have yet, taking out loans against assets still in probate. Sloppy, emotional, exactly what I expected. Late nights in my home office became my war room. I pulled every document I'd ever signed for them, every deed, every co-signature, every guarantee. What emerged was a web of financial entanglement they'd never bothered to understand because I'd always handled the details. They'd been so eager to use my expertise and credit that they'd left themselves vulnerable in ways they couldn't imagine. The lake house was my first thread to pull. While the deed had been transferred to Victor, I discovered something beautiful in the paperwork. I was still listed as the primary on the tax documents and the co-signer on the equity line of credit they'd opened against it. More importantly, the transfer had been done 2 weeks before Dad's death, when he was heavily medicated. Interesting. I called Martin Hale at 10:15 on a Wednesday morning. Martin and I had worked together at Sterling and Wade before he'd left to start his own practice specializing in real estate law. He owed me a favor or two. I'd sent him dozens of referrals over the years. Elena. His voice was warm through the phone. I heard about your father. I'm so sorry. Thank you. Martin. I need your help with something. Quietly. There was a pause. Martin was sharp. He could hear the edge in my voice. Come by my office after 5. We'll talk privately. That meeting changed everything. Martin reviewed my documents with the focus of a surgeon, occasionally making notes, sometimes raising an eyebrow. When he finally looked up, there was something like admiration in his eyes. You have more leverage than you realize, he said, spreading the papers across his conference table. This lake house transfer is questionable at best, fraudulent at worst. The equity line lists you as primary borrower. They can't legally exclude you from an asset you're financially liable for. And these receipts, Elena. This is a clear pattern of financial exploitation. I don't want to sue them, I said carefully. I want something better. Martin leaned back, a small smile playing at his lips. You want justice? I want everything. We spent 3 hours building the strategy. First, I would need to secure my position by freezing anything that still had my name attached. Then, systematically document every financial irregularity. Finally, When the time was right, present them with a choice. Do this the easy way or the legal way. I started pulling records that week. Credit reports showed Victor had been using my Social Security number as a guarantor on 3 business loans I'd never known about identity theft. Technically, Irene had listed me as a co-applicant on store credit cards, running up $20,000 in debt that was affecting my credit score. The joint account I'd opened years ago to help manage Dad's medical bills. They were still using it, and I was still the primary account holder. My forensic accounting revealed more. The family investment account Dad had opened decades ago still listed me as a beneficiary, something the will couldn't supersede without proper documentation, which they'd conveniently forgotten to file. The life insurance policy through his veterans benefits, I was still the listed beneficiary from when he'd updated it during his separation from Irene 5 years ago. She'd never bothered to check. I created spreadsheets with the obsessive detail of someone who'd spent years organizing other people's finances. Every transaction, every transfer, every discrepancy cataloged and cross-referenced. The pattern that emerged was damning. In the 6 months before Dad's death, while he was declining from cancer, there had been massive transfers from his accounts to Irene and Victor. The signatures on these transfers were shaky, inconsistent. Some dated from days I knew he'd been hospitalized, barely conscious from morphine. Martin introduced me to Patricia Vance, a forensic accountant who specialized in elder financial abuse cases. She looked at my documentation and whistled low. "This is textbook exploitation," she said, flipping through my color-coded folders. The timing, the amounts, the condition of the victim, any prosecutor would salivate over this. But I wasn't going to prosecutors. Not yet. That was my nuclear option, held in reserve. Instead, I was going to use their greed and ignorance against them. They thought they'd won the game, but they didn't even know what game we were playing. I sat in my apartment at 2 a.m, looking at the chess pieces I'd arranged. Every document locked in a safety deposit box with copies in Martin's office. Every legal avenue explored and mapped. Every vulnerability in their plan identified and ready to exploit. They wanted to erase me from the family fortune fine, but they'd forgotten one crucial thing. I wasn't just the helper. I was the one who understood how everything worked. And now, finally, I was going to use that knowledge for myself. The first cut was the cleanest. On a Thursday morning at 9:30 sharp, I walked into Regions Bank on Bull Street and closed every account that bore my name. The joint checking account I'd opened to help manage Dad's bills closed. $43,000 transferred to my personal account. The savings account I'd co-signed for Victor's business expenses, frozen and flagged for fraud investigation. The credit line secured by my income that Irene had been quietly drawing from terminated effective immediately. I didn't warn them. Why would I? They hadn't warned me before cutting me out of the will. Victor's first call came at 11:47 that morning. I let it go to voicemail while I sat in a client meeting, calmly discussing retirement portfolios while my phone buzzed incessantly in my purse. By the time I listened to the messages at lunch, there were 17 of them, each more frantic than the last. "Elena, there's some kind of mistake with the accounts. Call me back immediately. What did you do? This isn't funny anymore. You're destroying everything Dad built." That last one almost made me laugh. What Dad built with whose money Irene's meltdown came via text at 2:15 that afternoon. Her Nordstrom card had been declined during a very public lunch with her garden club ladies. The humiliation bled through every capitalized word. "Fix this now. You have no right. This is theft." Theft. She really said that. The woman who'd been siphoning from my accounts for a decade was accusing me of theft for taking back what was mine. I responded to neither of them. Instead, I continued my methodical dismantling. The utilities at the lake house that were still in my name scheduled for disconnection. The insurance policies where I was listed as guarantor canceled. The cell phone family plan I'd been paying for since 2015, every line except mine terminated. By evening, the real panic had set in. Victor showed up at my apartment building at 7:20, but I'd already warned Eddie, the doorman, not to let him up. I watched from my window as he paced outside, phone pressed to his ear, gesturing wildly at nothing. He looked smaller from 5 stories up, less intimidating than the older brother who'd always made me feel like the family charity case. The next morning, Irene tried a different approach. She showed up at Sterling and Wade at 8:45, dressed in her morning best, tears already streaming when she approached the reception desk. But I'd anticipated this too. HR had been briefed, security was aware, and she was politely but firmly escorted out before she could make it past the lobby. "Your family seems upset," my boss Richard observed, standing in my office doorway with his coffee. "Death brings out the worst in people," I replied, not looking up from my computer. "And the best," he said meaningfully. "That Thompson estate you handled last month. The family called, said you were the only person who treated them with genuine compassion during their loss. They're referring 3 more clients." The irony wasn't lost on me. I could show compassion to strangers, but had finally run out of it for my own blood. The weekend brought new developments. Victor's business credit cards started declining, without my credit score propping up his applications, without the false guarantees he'd been filing with my information. His house of cards was collapsing. He'd been living on borrowed time and borrowed money mine, and now the bills were coming due. I got a call from Marcus at the Mercedes dealership on Saturday afternoon. "Ms. Monroe, I'm calling about your brother's lease. Since you're the guarantor, I wanted to inform you that we'll need to repossess the vehicle if the past due amount isn't settled by Monday." "I'm no longer the guarantor," I informed him smoothly. "You'll find I removed myself from that obligation last week, as was my right under the terms you'll see in subsection 12B. Mr. Monroe will need to handle this himself." There was a pause. I'll need to verify this with our legal department. Please do. Have them contact Martin Hale's office if they have questions. Irene's crisis came Sunday evening, without the steady drain from my accounts, without the credit cards I'd been unknowingly backing. She couldn't maintain the facade. The East Gaston house she'd been bragging about renovating. The contractors wanted payment up front now that her credit checks were bouncing back. The garden club gala she was organizing. The venue called to confirm the deposit that had been declined 3 times. But the masterstroke came when I checked the mail on Monday. The equity line of credit statement for the lake house arrived, showing they'd already borrowed against it heavily, assuming I'd keep paying as I always had. Except now, with my name frozen on the account, the automatic payments had stopped. They were in default. I sat at my kitchen table, sorting through the debris of their financial catastrophe, feeling something I hadn't expected: peace. Not joy, not revenge-fueled satisfaction, just peace. For the first time in my adult life, my money was mine. My credit was mine. My future was mine. My phone had been silent for 12 hours. They'd finally stopped calling, stopped texting, stopped believing they could guilt or rage me into submission. But I knew this wasn't over. This was just the eye of the storm. They'd regroup, strategize, come at me with everything they had. But they'd already lost the most important battle. They'd shown me exactly who they were, and more importantly, they'd shown me who I could be when I stopped being their safety net. The summons came through Aunt Delia, of all people, Tuesday afternoon at 3:20. She called with her sweetest voice, the one that meant she'd been recruited for dirty work. "Elena, honey, your mother and Victor want to have a family meeting, tomorrow at 7 at the house. It's important we all come together during this difficult time." "I'll be there," I said simply. I'd been expecting this. I arrived at the East Gaston house at 7 precisely, Martin's number on speed dial, Patricia's forensic accounting report in my leather portfolio, and every documented receipt backed up in 3 locations. Irene had pulled out all the stops the good china was out, Dad's bourbon on the sideboard, even fresh flowers from her garden. The living room was full: Irene, Victor, Aunt Delia, Uncle Robert, and 3 cousins who had no business being there except as an audience. "Elena," Irene began, seated in what had been Dad's chair like she was holding court, "this behavior has to stop. You're destroying the family." "Which behavior specifically?" I asked, taking a seat across from them, portfolio in my lap. Victor leaned forward, his face flushed. You know damn well what you've done. The accounts, the credit lines, my car, you've sabotaged everything out of spite. Spite. I opened my portfolio slowly, deliberately. Let's talk about spite. Victor. I laid out the first document. This is a receipt for $10,000 I gave you in March of 2019 for your food truck venture. You said it was a 2-month loan. Next document. This is the $15,000 for your app development in 2020. 6-month loan, you promised. Another. $25,000 for the brewery investment. You were going to triple my money in a year. Remember. The room was silent. I continued. Irene, here's every emergency I've covered. The papers kept coming. $3,000 for dental work that became veneers. $8,000 for property taxes you spent on a cruise. $12,000 for the roof after the hurricane. $5,000 for Dad's medications when you forgot to pay the insurance premiums. Family helps family, Irene started, but I cut her off. Family does help family. I've helped to the tune of $97,000 over the past decade. Not loans gifts, because family doesn't charge interest, right? That's what you always said when you promised to pay me back. Uncle Robert shifted uncomfortably. The cousins were looking anywhere but at me. But here's the interesting part, I continued, pulling out Patricia's report. In the 6 months before Dad died, while he was on morphine, barely conscious some days, there were transfers totaling $300,000 from his accounts to yours, signed on dates when hospital records show he was intubated. How dare you? Irene gasped. But there was fear behind the outrage. How dare I? Let's talk about this lake house transfer. I held up the deed. Transferred to Victor 2 weeks before Dad's death, while I was still paying off the $42,000 in back taxes to save it from foreclosure. My name is still on the equity line you've been draining, making me legally liable for your debts while being excluded from the asset. You're twisting everything, Victor said, but his voice had lost its edge. Am I? Should we discuss the 3 business loans you took out using my social security number, the credit cards Irene opened in my name? That's identity theft and fraud. Victor, federal crimes. Aunt Delia stood up. I think I should go. Sit down, Delia, I said sharply. You wanted to witness family business, witness this. I pulled out the final document. This is a legal filing prepared by Martin Hale. It details elder financial abuse, identity theft, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. 1 signature from me, and it goes to the district attorney's office. The room erupted. Victor jumped to his feet. Irene was crying real tears this time, and Uncle Robert was trying to play mediator. I sat perfectly still, watching them unravel. Enough, I said finally, and something in my voice made them stop. Here's what's going to happen. The lake house deed gets transferred to me immediately. I'm the only one who has any legal claim to it anyway. The equity line debt you've accumulated, that's yours to figure out. The fraudulent accounts in my name get closed and reported properly so my credit can be repaired, and every penny of Dad's money you transferred while he was incompetent gets accounted for. Or what? Victor tried to sound threatening, but it came out desperate. Or I file this with the DA, and we let a judge decide who the real thief is. Elder abuse carries up to 10 years in Georgia. Victor, fraud adds another 5 to 20. And that's before we get to the IRS, who'll be very interested in how you've been reporting these transfers. Irene's face had gone pale. You wouldn't. The scandal. The scandal of a daughter who funded her family for years only to be cut out of everything, or the scandal of a mother and son who potentially stole from a dying man. Which headline do you think the Savannah Morning News would prefer? The silence stretched like a taut wire. Finally, Irene spoke, her voice barely a whisper. What do you want? I want the lake house transferred to me by Friday. I want every fraudulent account closed and documented. I want a written statement acknowledging the debts you owe me, not for collection, just for the record. And I want you to honor Dad's real wishes, not the ones you manipulated him into. And if we do this, Victor asked, then I walk away. No lawsuit, no criminal charges, No public humiliation. You keep the East Gaston house, the remaining money, whatever's left of your dignity. But you never contact me for money again." I stood, gathering my documents. "You have 48 hours to decide." Martin's office has copies of everything. Try to destroy evidence or flee, and it goes straight to the authorities. As I walked to the door, Irene called out, "You're really going to destroy your own family." I turned back, meeting her eyes. "No, Irene. You destroyed this family when you decided I was worth less than my bank account. I'm just collecting what's mine." 3 weeks passed in hostile silence. They'd signed the papers the lake house was mine, the fraudulent accounts closed, the debts acknowledged in writing, but I knew them too well to think it was over. They were regrouping, crafting a narrative where they were the victims and I was the ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned family in their time of need. The memorial dinner was scheduled for a month after Dad's funeral, a Catholic tradition Irene had suddenly embraced despite not setting foot in church for 20 years. She'd rented the ballroom at the Marriott Riverfront, invited every distant relative, family friend, and business associate Dad had ever known. It was her stage for rehabilitation, her chance to restore the family image, and I knew I'd be the villain in whatever story she'd scripted. I arrived at 6:45, wearing the same black dress from the funeral, but with my grandmother's pearl necklace, the one Irene thought she'd inherited, but I'd retrieved from Dad's safety deposit box with documentation proving he'd given it to me years ago. The ballroom was packed, maybe 100 people, all the Savannah old guard who thrived on family drama disguised as sympathy. Irene held court near the memorial display. Photos of Dad through the years, carefully curated to show the perfect family. Victor worked the room with his politician's smile, no doubt spinning tales of business ventures and family legacy. Neither acknowledged my arrival. During dinner, the microphone was passed around for people to share memories. Sweet stories about Dad's generosity, his humor, his dedication to family. Then Victor stood, tapping his wine glass for attention. "I want to thank everyone for being here," he began, his voice carrying that false warmth he'd perfected. "These past weeks have been incredibly difficult, not just losing Dad, but watching our family torn apart by greed and entitlement." The room shifted uncomfortably. Here it came. "Some people," he continued, looking directly at me, "believe that money matters more than blood. That keeping score of every penny makes them entitled to destroy a grieving family. Dad would be heartbroken to see what's happened to his legacy, how his wishes have been perverted by someone who can't accept that family means sacrifice without expectation of reward." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Aunt Delia was nodding sympathetically. Cousins were shooting me pitying looks, but not the kind that suggested sympathy for me. I set down my wine glass and stood. "May I asked, walking toward the microphone. Victor tried to hold on to it, but I simply waited, patient, until the room's attention forced him to hand it over. "My father," I began, my voice steady and clear, "taught me that actions speak louder than words. So let me share some actions with you all." I pulled out my phone, connecting it to the venue's screen system, a feature I'd confirmed was available when I'd called ahead. "This is a photo from Dad's 70th birthday at the lake house. Beautiful property, isn't it? I should know I paid $42,000 to save it from foreclosure 3 years ago." The first receipt appeared on screen. "Here's the documentation." Gasps scattered through the room. "When Dad needed cancer treatment, I covered what insurance wouldn't." More receipts. "When the East Gaston house needed a new roof after Hurricane Matthew, I paid for it." Another receipt. "When Victor's business ventures failed, all 4 of them, I covered the losses." The receipts kept coming, displayed for everyone to see. $97,000 over 10 years. Not loans, gifts, because family helps family, as my mother always said while promising to pay me back. "Elena, this is inappropriate," Irene started, but I kept going. "You want to know what's inappropriate, taking advantage of a dying man? These are bank records showing massive transfers from Dad's accounts while he was on morphine, barely conscious. signatures on dates when hospital records show he was intubated. You want to talk about perverting Dad's wishes. The screen showed Patricia's forensic accounting summary. The room was dead silent. But here's the truly heartbreaking part, I continued, my voice finally cracking slightly. I would have given them everything anyway. If they'd just asked, if they'd just once, acknowledged what I'd sacrificed. Instead, they wrote me out of the will because I'd always been provided for. Yes, I provided for everyone but myself. I looked around the room, meeting eyes with family friends who'd watched me grow up, who'd seen me at every family crisis, every emergency, always the one handling things. Mr. Davidson, I addressed Dad's former business partner, who called you at 11 at night when Dad had his heart attack 5 years ago, who sat in the hospital for 3 days managing his affairs while Irene was in Hilton Head and Victor was unreachable in Vegas. He nodded slowly, understanding dawning on his face. Mrs. Patterson, I turned to a family friend, who organized every holiday dinner for the past decade, who made sure Dad took his medications, drove him to every appointment, held his hand through chemo when everyone else was too busy. She was dabbing at her eyes now. I'm not the one who destroyed this family, I said, handing the microphone back to a stunned Victor. I'm just the one who finally stopped enabling its destruction. Dad didn't leave me out of the will because I didn't need anything. They manipulated him into leaving me out because they needed everything, including what was mine. I walked back to my seat, picked up my purse, and headed for the door. But before I left, I turned back one more time. Oh, and Victor, that lake house you've been telling everyone you're going to turn into a luxury rental, it's mine now, legally, properly, irrevocably mine. And the first thing I'm going to do is scatter Dad's real ashes there, not the portion you kept for this show, because that's what he actually wanted to be at peace at the lake with his parents, not displayed at a Marriott for Savannah society to gossip over. The last thing I heard as the ballroom doors closed behind me was the eruption of 100 conversations at once, the sound of a carefully constructed facade finally, completely crumbling. 6 months later, I stood on the dock of my lake house, really mine now, with my name alone on the deed, watching the sunset over the South Carolina water. The legal battles were over, the sale had been finalized, and I'd used the money wisely, paid off all debts, set aside a solid emergency fund, and invested the rest conservatively. No more gambling on other people's dreams. Victor's latest venture had collapsed within 3 months, just as I'd predicted. Without my credit to leverage, without my money to cushion his failures, he'd had to face reality. Last I heard, he was working as a mid-level manager at a logistics company in Atlanta, a real job with a real paycheck. Probably the best thing that ever happened to him. The Mercedes was long gone, replaced with a used Honda. Irene had been forced to downsize. The East Gaston house was too expensive to maintain without my constant infusions of cash, so she'd sold it and moved into a 2-bedroom condo near the historic district. She told everyone it was because the house held too many memories. But I knew the truth: she couldn't afford the property taxes. The garden club had quietly dropped her from the membership rolls when she couldn't pay the annual dues. They'd tried to reconcile once, showing up at my Charleston townhouse on a Sunday afternoon in March. I'd bought the place with cash, a modest 3-bedroom in the French Quarter with original hardwood floors and a garden that reminded me of happier times. Through the Ring doorbell camera, I watched them stand on my porch for 20 minutes, ringing repeatedly, before finally accepting that I wouldn't answer. The flying monkeys came next, relatives calling to say I should forgive. That family is forever. That holding grudges would only hurt me in the end. But I wasn't holding a grudge. I was holding a boundary, and for the first time in my life, it felt like freedom. My business at Sterling & Wade had exploded. Turns out, when you're not constantly stressed about family drama, when you're not spending your evenings managing other people's finances for free, you can focus on your actual career. I'd been promoted to senior partner, the youngest in the firm's history, my specialty estate planning for complicated families. I could spot financial exploitation from a mile away now. The best part was the peace. No more 2A, panic calls about manufactured emergencies. No more guilt trips disguised as family obligations. No more watching my bank account drain while being told I was lucky to have a job. My money was mine. My time was mine. My life was finally, completely mine. I'd kept one photo from the old life Dad and me at the lake when I was 7, both of us holding fishing poles, grinning at the camera. He was teaching me to bait a hook, patient with my squeamishness about the worms. That was before the money got complicated, before Irene's spending and Victor's failures, before family became a business transaction where I was always the one paying. "I did what you taught me, Dad," I said to the photo, now framed on the dock's railing. I took care of the family, but I finally learned that family includes me too. The ashes I'd scattered here weren't the ornate urn Irene had displayed at the memorial dinner. Those had been only a portion, kept for show. The real ashes, the majority of them, I'd scattered here where he'd wanted to be, with his parents, at peace on the water he'd loved. This was the real memorial, the one that mattered. A text came through from Sarah, my assistant who'd become a real friend. "Dinner tomorrow at 7, that new seafood place on King Street." "I'll be there," I typed back. I had a life now, real friendships not based on what I could provide financially. As the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the lake to gold, I thought about the inheritance I'd actually received. It wasn't the money, though getting what was legally mine had certainly helped. It wasn't the property, though standing on this dock felt like justice. The real inheritance was the lesson learned in the hardest possible way that sometimes the most profound act of self-love is refusing to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. Irene and Victor had thought they were taking everything from me when they cut me out of the will. Instead, they'd given me something priceless permission to cut them out of my life. They'd meant to erase me, but in trying to make me nothing, they'd freed me to become everything I was meant to be. I walked back to my house, and poured a glass of Dad's favorite bourbon. The good stuff, not the rot gut Victor used to buy with my money and claim was premium. Tomorrow, I had a presentation for a new client, a widow whose children were circling like vultures. I'd make sure she protected herself in ways I wished I'd known to protect myself earlier. But tonight, I sat on my porch, listening to the cicadas and the gentle lap of water against the dock, feeling something I hadn't felt in years whole, not because I'd taken revenge, but because I'd taken back what was always mine, not just money or property, but my dignity, my self-worth, and my right to exist as more than just a resource for others to exploit. The helper had become the heir after all, not to their money, but to my own life. And that inheritance was worth more than anything they could have left me in a will. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let's connect. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your own thoughts and experiences. Sometimes the best inheritance we can receive is the strength to finally stand up for ourselves.